Picture this. You open your eyes in a chamber of gold and marble, a palace meant to be the very symbol of power and wealth. Yet the first thing you feel is not luxury, it is pain. Your spine twists when you try to sit up, your jaw aches when you attempt to chew, your mind clouds with thoughts you cannot explain. And deep inside you know, none of this is your fault. It began centuries before you were born, with kings and queens who believed themselves chosen by God. They saw their blood as sacred, superior, untouchable. And to protect that so-called purity, they married their cousins, their nieces, sometimes even closer relations. Every generation repeated the same mistake. Every generation paid the price. The cost was never paid by the kings who signed treaties or the advisors who arranged the marriages. The cost was carried in the bodies of the daughters, young women who grew up not as individuals, but as breeding vessels for dynasties. This is not fiction. This is not legend. This was the reality of some of the most powerful women in European history. And their stories are among the darkest tales ever erased by the glitter of crowns. For centuries, Europe's royal families convinced themselves of one twisted idea, that power could be protected in blood. Marrying outside of their circle meant contamination. So instead, they circled inward, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, generation after generation until their family trees resembled not a branching oak but a choking vine. Spain, Austria, France, all fell victim to this obsession. But none so fatally as the Habsburg dynasty. Their unofficial motto could have been, "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." Yet those marriages were anything but happy. They were calculated gambles that produced children born already broken, lives predetermined to suffer under the weight of genetic collapse. Vienna, 1634. A girl is born in the cold halls of the Hofburg Palace. Her name, Maria Anna of Austria. From her first breath, she is trapped. Her tiny body shows the marks of centuries of inbreeding, her back curves painfully, her jaw juts so far forward she struggles to eat. Every meal is a test of endurance, servants cutting meat into tiny pieces, hours spent chewing what should take minutes. But the cruelest wound is not physical. It is the realization that she is not unique. On the walls of the palace hang portraits of her ancestors, men and women with the same protruding jaws, the same bent spines, the same empty eyes. She understands, even as a child, that she has inherited not just a crown but a curse. Doctors whisper about the Habsburg curse, though never in her presence. To her face they call it God's will. But everyone knows the truth. Maria Anna was doomed by her parents' obsession with blood purity. She grows up isolated, hidden behind curtains so that foreign ambassadors will not see her twisted frame. Suitors, always cousins, always relatives, recoil when they meet her. Proposals collapse before they begin. Even in a world where cousin marriages are the norm, she is deemed too broken. Her escape comes only in books. She devours texts about worlds where people marry for love, where children are born without deformities, where life is not predetermined by the mistakes of ancestors. But books cannot change reality. At 32, Maria Anna's body gives out. The official cause of death lists fevers, weakness, ailments, but the truth? She died from centuries of choices she never made. If Maria Anna's tragedy was written on her body, Joanna of Castile's was written on her mind. Born in 1479, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs who funded Columbus, Joanna should have been powerful. Instead, she became known by a cruel nickname, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly mad? Or simply another victim of the genetic and political traps of her family? Her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy was meant to unite kingdoms. Instead, it shattered her. Philip was cold, unfaithful, cruel. Joanna's response, an obsessive, desperate love, was interpreted as insanity. But can we blame her? Raised to believe her sole duty was marriage and children, she clung to the only person she was told to depend on. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief turned into something darker. She refused to bury him, traveling across Spain with his coffin, opening it to kiss his decaying face. Horrifying. Yes. But also the desperate act of a woman stripped of every human connection. Her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, used her so-called madness as a political weapon. They locked her away for 46 years in the convent of Santa Clara. 46 years of dark rooms, neglect, humiliation. Reports say she tore her clothes, screamed for hours, refused to eat. But ask yourself, was that insanity? Or was that the predictable collapse of a woman imprisoned, grieving, genetically vulnerable to depression and anxiety? Joanna died in 1555, still confined, still officially insane. History dismissed her as a madwoman. But look closer and you'll see, she was a casualty of bloodlines that demanded loyalty to purity over love, and politics over humanity. Madrid, 1651. In the magnificent Alcazar Palace, the birth of a little girl is celebrated with fireworks and ringing bells. Her name, Margaret Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and, shockingly, his niece Mariana of Austria. From her first moments, Margaret is a product of generations of twisted family trees. To outsiders, she appears healthy and precious, dressed in silks and lace. But Diego Velázquez, the royal painter, captures more than just her beauty. In his portraits, we see a child who looks fragile, her posture already stiff, her expression distant. Behind the splendor lies the weight of a genetic curse. Margaret grows up in the suffocating environment of the Spanish court. Every movement is documented, every smile painted, every breath political. But her destiny is decided before she can even speak. She is promised to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. Yes, her father's brother. For courtiers, this is triumph, the Habsburg line will remain pure. For Margaret, it is a death sentence disguised as a marriage contract. At 15, she becomes a bride. Leopold, 26 years old, takes her hand before God and empire. The wedding is celebrated across Europe with festivals and grand feasts. But in her private chambers, Margaret faces the cruel truth. She is a child, fragile in body, expected to perform the duties of a wife and mother. From the beginning, Margaret struggles. Her health is poor, she is often pale, her body weak, her breathing shallow. But none of this matters to the empire. Her only purpose is to give birth to heirs. Pregnancy after pregnancy follows. The first, a daughter, dies within months. The second ends in miscarriage. Each loss carves pieces out of Margaret's already fragile soul. Court physicians, bound by their ignorance of genetics, subject her to endless cures, bloodletting, bizarre diets, prayers whispered over her bed. Nothing helps. Finally, she gives birth to a son who survives infancy, but even he carries the marks of the Habsburg curse. His jaw juts forward, his frame fragile. The court breathes a sigh of relief that an heir exists, but for Margaret, it is no victory. It is a continuation of the nightmare. Her own body collapses under the strain. Modern doctors would likely diagnose her with severe anemia, chronic respiratory problems, and neurological issues, possibly epilepsy. But in her time, her suffering is invisible, dismissed as weakness or divine punishment. By the age of 21, Margaret Theresa is exhausted beyond repair. Her body simply cannot continue. In 1673, after only 6 years of marriage, she dies. The official cause, fever. The real cause, a dynasty that devoured its daughters. Her death plunges the court into mourning, not for the girl herself, but for the loss of a womb that could have produced more heirs. Before Margaret's tragedy, another Habsburg woman had already lived the same curse, Anna of Austria. Born in 1601, she was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, again, an uncle-niece union. From childhood, she carried the family traits, a prominent jaw, difficulty speaking, bouts of melancholy. But she was destined for one of the most prestigious marriages of the era, becoming Queen of France as the wife of Louis XIII. At just 14, Anna was sent from Madrid to Versailles. Imagine, a teenage girl, terrified, speaking broken French, stepping into a court infamous for its cruelty. She was supposed to cement peace between two empires. But her personal happiness was never considered. Louis XIII, her husband, was cold and distant, possibly depressed, possibly uninterested in women altogether. Their marriage was more political arrangement than partnership. For years, Anna endured humiliation after humiliation, miscarriages, stillbirths, endless whispers that she was cursed. Doctors blamed her for every failure. They cut her, bled her, forced her to drink foul concoctions. They examined her body as if she were livestock, not a queen. After 23 years of this torment, a miracle happened. Anna gave birth to a son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. France rejoiced. Anna was finally redeemed. Yet behind the celebrations, she remained the same broken woman, anxious, depressed, physically fragile. She would go on to produce another son, but her health never recovered. Court records describe melancholy attacks that left her bedridden for days. Modern science would recognize severe anxiety disorders, worsened by generations of inbreeding. Anna died in 1666, having fulfilled her duty to produce heirs. But what history celebrates as triumph was in truth another tragedy, a girl sacrificed on the altar of dynasty. When we read these stories, Margaret Theresa dead at 21, Anna of Austria locked in cycles of depression, we must remember the truth hidden beneath the crowns and jewels. These women were not queens in control of empires. They were daughters and wives trapped in a breeding system that cared nothing for their pain. Every cough, every miscarriage, every bone deformity whispered the same truth: the bloodline was rotting from within. But the men who ruled refused to listen. They continued marrying daughters to uncles, nieces to cousins, as if tradition mattered more than survival. And the women, voiceless, powerless, were left to pay the price with their bodies. When most people hear the name Marie Antoinette, they think of extravagant gowns, sparkling diamonds, and the infamous phrase, "Let them eat cake." But few remember that she, too, carried the genetic scars of the Habsburg dynasty. Born in 1755, Marie Antoinette was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. Her parents were not as closely related as some earlier Habsburg couples, yet centuries of cousin marriages already poisoned the bloodline. Portraits of Marie Antoinette show beauty, yes, but look closer. The slightly protruding lip. The faint shadow of the Habsburg jawline. She inherited not just the family's wealth and titles, but also their hidden weaknesses. At 14, she was sent to France to marry the awkward and shy Dauphin, Louis XVI. Imagine being a teenager torn from your home, thrust into the cold, glittering court of Versailles, surrounded by people waiting for you to fail. That was her reality. And fail she did, or at least that was the perception. For 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated. No children. No heir. And in a world where a queen's only worth was her ability to produce sons, that was a catastrophe. Behind closed doors, Marie Antoinette suffered. She endured what doctors of her time called feminine difficulties. Severe menstrual problems, irregular cycles, miscarriages. Modern medicine would identify them as hormonal imbalances, worsened by inbreeding. Louis XVI had his own struggles. Some historians suggest he suffered from phimosis, a medical condition making intimacy painful. Others argue it was psychological, social anxiety, developmental delays, possibly linked to the same genetic weaknesses that haunted the Habsburgs. Whatever the truth, both husband and wife were broken by forces beyond their control. But society blamed Marie. Rumors spread like wildfire: she was barren, cursed, frigid. Pamphlets circulated in Paris mocking her as Madame Deficit, a foreign parasite draining France's wealth. Finally, after humiliating years of scrutiny, she gave birth to a daughter. Later came more pregnancies, some successful, some ending in miscarriage or infant death. Each loss hollowed her further, yet the pressure never lifted. A single daughter was never enough. France demanded sons. The image of Marie Antoinette as careless and frivolous hides the truth of a woman cracking under impossible expectations. Witnesses described her as impulsive, emotional, prone to wild mood swings, symptoms that modern psychiatrists might recognize as bipolar tendencies or severe anxiety disorders. Her genetic inheritance made her vulnerable, but her environment weaponized that vulnerability. Every mistake, every tear, every extravagant purchase was magnified by the venom of a public hungry for revolution. As France descended into chaos, Marie's fragility became fatal. She lashed out when she should have stayed silent. She trusted when she should have been cautious. And she collapsed under pressures no one could endure alone. By the time of her imprisonment, the mask of the queen was gone. Guards described her as pale, distracted, sometimes confused. During interrogations, she often drifted into silence, unable to answer questions. She was not the monster her enemies painted, she was a woman broken by genetics, politics, and grief. In 1793, she faced the guillotine with dignity. But her death was not just the fall of a queen. It was the symbolic end of centuries of royal inbreeding that had poisoned bloodlines across Europe. If Marie Antoinette was the face of fragility, Charles II of Spain was the living proof of genetic disaster. Born in 1661, Charles was the great-grandson of multiple uncle-niece and cousin marriages. His family tree was so tangled that modern geneticists calculated his inbreeding coefficient to be higher than if he had been the child of siblings. The results were catastrophic. Charles could not walk properly until he was 8. He did not speak until he was 4. His jaw was so deformed he could barely chew. His tongue was so swollen that he drooled constantly and struggled to articulate words. Nicknamed El Hechizado, the bewitched, people whispered that he was cursed. In truth, he was the inevitable product of centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Worse, he was impotent. His 2 marriages produced no children. Court doctors tried every bizarre remedy imaginable, potions, exorcisms, magical rituals, but nothing worked. Spain depended on him to continue the Habsburg line, but his broken body and mind made that impossible. When Charles died in 1700 at the age of 38, childless, the Spanish Habsburg line collapsed. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a bloody conflict across Europe. But behind the politics lies the more personal tragedy. Charles II was not just a king. He was a boy born to suffer, not because of God's curse but because his ancestors refused to let bloodlines breathe. Charles's sisters and cousins, the Infantas of Spain, tell another chapter of this nightmare. Maria Margarita, born in 1651, struggled to walk and speak. Court notes describe her as slow of mind, likely on the autism spectrum, though such words did not exist at the time. Her sister Maria Theresa suffered from epilepsy so severe she often collapsed in public. Another cousin had a spine so twisted she could not sit upright without assistance. Yet every one of these women was expected to marry and bear children. Their bodies, already failing, were forced into pregnancies that often ended in stillbirths or the deaths of the mothers themselves. Letters between these women, preserved in archives, are heartbreaking. They write of miscarriages, of babies born too weak to breathe, of the fear of facing another pregnancy. But they also write of shame, because they believed their failures were personal sins, not genetic inevitabilities. They lived as case studies of a dynasty unraveling, their pain treated as medical curiosity rather than human tragedy. For centuries, doctors, priests, and courtiers whispered about the Habsburg curse. They spoke of God's punishment, of witchcraft, of mysterious illnesses that no one could explain. But today, science gives us the answers they never dared to confront. When close relatives marry, their children inherit not just beauty, wealth, and titles, but also hidden weaknesses. Every human carries recessive genes, tiny, often silent mutations that rarely cause harm because they are balanced by healthy genes from an unrelated partner. But when cousins, uncles, and nieces reproduce generation after generation, those harmful genes are duplicated, amplified, and unleashed. This process is called inbreeding depression. It doesn't just affect looks. It weakens immune systems, reduces fertility, increases the risk of mental illness, and shortens lifespans. For the Habsburgs, the most visible sign was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw so severe in some descendants that they could not close their mouths properly or chew solid food. But the visible deformities were only the surface. Beneath them lay epilepsy, anemia, intellectual disabilities, anxiety, depression, and infertility. The family's obsession with pure blood created not strength, but fragility. Kings and queens sat on thrones, but their bodies were breaking from within. The Spanish and Austrian courts kept meticulous medical records. Doctors measured the angles of jaws, described seizures in detail, noted every miscarriage and every malformed infant. These reports, still preserved in archives, read like grim textbooks of genetic collapse. Yet no one dared state the obvious. Physicians attributed the conditions to humors, melancholy, or the will of God. The truth, that royal bloodlines were choking themselves, was too dangerous to admit. Even when patterns were undeniable, when generation after generation showed the same defects, the dynasty pressed forward. Political alliances mattered more than the health of daughters. A young woman's suffering was never a reason to change course. Perhaps the cruelest truth is this: the burden of inbreeding fell hardest on women. Royal daughters were not seen as individuals. They were bargaining chips, wombs to be traded for treaties. Their health, their emotions, their very lives were secondary to the question of whether they could produce heirs. If a girl was weak or deformed, she was still forced into marriage. If she miscarried again and again, doctors bled her, starved her, prayed over her, but never freed her from her duty. If she descended into depression or madness, her condition was labeled God's will or political inconvenience. Think of Joanna of Castile, locked away for nearly half a century. Or Margaret Teresa, dead at 21 after pregnancies that her frail body could never endure. Or the countless infantas whose names are forgotten, remembered only in letters describing their seizures, their deformities, their dead children. They were not queens of power. They were experiments in a dynasty's obsession with itself. One might ask, why didn't anyone stop this? Why didn't the Church, with all its authority, forbid such dangerous unions? The truth is darker. The Catholic Church provided dispensations for marriages between close relatives, even uncle and niece, when it served political power. The idea was that royal bloodlines were divinely chosen, and preserving their purity was more important than preventing human suffering. So priests blessed unions that science today would call catastrophic. They spoke of God's favor while standing at altars where girls married their own uncles. They preached of purity while condemning daughters to genetic destruction. It wasn't until the collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line with Charles II in 1700 that Europe began to understand the cost. His death without heirs triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict across the continent. Suddenly, the price of inbreeding wasn't just private tragedy, it was political disaster. Gradually, royal families adjusted. Cousin marriages did not disappear overnight, but they became less extreme. courts began to look outside their immediate circles for spouses. The idea of pure blood slowly gave way to survival. But for the women who lived and died before that shift, it was too late. Their lives were the currency that bought Europe its lesson in genetics. In dusty archives, among fading letters and medical notes, fragments of these women's voices remain. A letter from a Spanish infanta describing her terror at another pregnancy: "I pray to God it ends quickly, for I fear what my body will bring forth." A note from a court physician: "The queen is melancholy again, we must try bleeding her." A report from a midwife: "The infant did not breathe. It was born twisted, as if crushed within." These are not numbers in a scientific chart. They are cries for help that no one answered. For the people of the 16th and 17th centuries, words like genetics or DNA did not exist. They could not explain why daughters of kings were born frail, why queens miscarried again and again, why jaws jutted forward generation after generation. They saw it as mystery, punishment, even sorcery. But centuries later, historians and geneticists looked back at the Habsburg dynasty and realized something astonishing: these tragedies became evidence. They were real-world case studies of what happens when inbreeding is taken to its extreme. When Charles II of Spain's family tree was reconstructed, scientists calculated that his inbreeding coefficient was as high as if he had been the child of siblings. That calculation shocked the scientific world. It proved mathematically how dangerous the practice had been. From their suffering came our understanding of recessive genes, hereditary diseases, and the necessity of genetic diversity. In short, the pain of these women, and the men too, helped shape the science that now saves lives. Still, science cannot erase the human cost. Behind every case study was a girl with a name, a face, a heartbeat. Maria Anna of Austria, who could not breathe without pain. Joanna of Castile, locked away for 46 years because grief was called madness. Margaret Teresa, dead before her 22nd birthday, her body drained by pregnancies she could never survive. Anna of Austria, blamed for childlessness when the problem was written in her blood. Marie Antoinette, vilified for weaknesses she could not control. And countless infantas, their stories lost in archives, remembered only through medical notes. They were not just queens. They were women who deserved choices, freedom, and dignity. Instead, their bodies became battlefields for dynasties. What makes their fate even more haunting is how normalized it was. Courtiers whispered, doctors scribbled, priests blessed, but no one screamed, no one stopped it. The suffering of women was hidden behind palace walls, disguised in portraits that showed gowns and jewels but never the pain beneath. Even today, many history books reduce them to footnotes: Joanna the Mad, the infertile queen, the weak princess. They are remembered by their failures, not by their humanity. But look closer, and you see resilience. Maria Anna read books until her last breath, refusing to let her mind be broken. Joanna clung to love even when it destroyed her. Anna of Austria endured humiliation and still gave birth to the Sun King. Marie Antoinette faced death with courage, walking to the guillotine with her head held high. Their strength lay not in power, but in survival. It's tempting to think these stories are only relics of a distant past. But even now, echoes of this tragedy remain. In isolated communities across the world, cousin marriages are still practiced. Sometimes it is tradition. Sometimes it is necessity. And still, children are born carrying double burdens of genetic disease. In modern societies, women are still reduced to their reproductive roles. Still judged for childlessness. Still blamed for miscarriages. Still pressured to sacrifice health for expectation. The stage may have changed, but the script feels familiar. The Habsburg women remind us of what happens when human worth is measured only by blood, only by wombs, only by obedience. When Charles II died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. His broken body symbolized centuries of choices that valued purity over survival. And in that ending lies the warning: greatness cannot be built on suffering. The true legacy of these women is not the crowns they wore or the treaties signed in their names. It is the lesson they left behind, that humanity must come before tradition, compassion before politics, love before bloodlines. They remind us that every girl, whether born in a palace or a village, deserves to live free of cages built by others. Close your eyes and imagine standing in one of their palaces today. The chandeliers glitter, the marble shines, tourists take photos. But if you listen closely, you might hear something else: the echo of footsteps in long corridors, the rustle of silk skirts, the muffled sob of a girl hidden behind heavy curtains. That is their voice, carried across centuries. A voice saying, "Remember us." Not as queens or pawns, but as women who bore the unbearable. Women who suffered so the world might finally learn that blood purity is a curse, not a blessing. History loves to dress up tragedy in velvet. When we picture queens of Spain, France, or Austria, we imagine glittering gowns, balls, and portraits framed in gold. But the reality behind those walls was more cruel than any fairy tale gone wrong. Every palace room held secrets of suffering. Every hallway echoed with footsteps of physicians rushing to yet another sickly child. Every chapel was filled with prayers not for peace or salvation, but for heirs, healthy, strong sons who never came. Behind the grandeur of dynastic marriages lay rows of graves, young queens buried after endless pregnancies, children dead in infancy, heirs who never reached adulthood. The palaces that symbolized Europe's greatest powers were, in truth, houses of mourning. Dynasties claimed to preserve divine right. But the people who paid the highest price were not kings, they were women. A king could father illegitimate children and be praised for virility. But a queen who miscarried was called cursed. A king could remarry if his wife died in childbirth. But the wife had no second chance, her life was simply over. A king could hide his deformities behind velvet robes and power. A queen had to expose her body to doctors, priests, midwives, and endless scrutiny. Their worth was measured in wombs. Their failures were written in history books. Their pain was forgotten the moment their role was finished. The Habsburg dynasty became a warning carved into flesh. They believed their blood made them superior, that purity was protection. But what they preserved was not greatness, it was weakness. Every uncle-niece marriage, every cousin union, every broken child was one step closer to collapse. By the time Charles II of Spain sat on the throne, the dynasty had become a caricature of itself, a king who could not rule, could not father children, could barely even feed himself without assistance. It was as if the dynasty had created its own curse, a slow suicide carried out in the name of tradition. Why does this story matter now, centuries later? Because it is not just about royal blood. It is about what happens when ideology matters more than humanity. The Habsburgs valued tradition over compassion. They sacrificed daughters for power. They silenced women, ignored suffering, and hid deformities behind painted portraits. Does that sound unfamiliar? Even today, around the world, women are pressured to marry against their will, to produce children regardless of their health, to carry burdens in silence. The costumes may have changed, but the theme remains. The curse of blood purity is simply one chapter in a larger story, the story of how societies control women's bodies in the name of family, religion, or politics. And yet, there is a strange redemption here. These women's suffering was not entirely lost. Their lives, recorded in medical notes, letters, and portraits, became evidence for future generations. Their broken bodies taught us the necessity of genetic diversity. Their tragedies laid the groundwork for modern medicine. In a way, their pain saved others. But that is not enough. We must not only thank science, we must remember the human beings who carried that weight. Maria Anna, Joanna, Margaret Teresa, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, the unnamed infantas. They were not just emblems of dynasties. They were daughters who wanted freedom, mothers who wanted healthy children, wives who wanted love. Imagine one last scene. You stand in a gallery in Madrid or Vienna. Portraits line the walls, queens in silks, princesses with jeweled crowns, children posed stiffly beside their parents. At first, you admire the splendor. But then you notice, the jaws too large, the eyes too distant, the spines too stiff. The beauty hides the pain, but it cannot erase it. If you listen carefully, you almost hear them whisper across the centuries. We were not monsters. We were not mad. We were not cursed. We were women, forced into cages of blood and duty. Remember us. Centuries have passed since the last Habsburg jaw jutted forward, since the last Spanish infanta gasped for air in a palace chamber, since Marie Antoinette walked to the guillotine. And yet, their shadows remain. Not just in museums, where portraits hang heavy with silence. Not just in textbooks, where they are reduced to strange footnotes. But in us, in the lessons we choose to remember or to forget. Because their story was never only about bloodlines. It was about what happens when power is worshipped above humanity. When women's lives are reduced to wombs, when suffering is hidden behind curtains of velvet and gold, when silence becomes the law of survival. The curse of pure bloodlines was not supernatural. It was man-made. It was signed in marriage contracts. It was blessed in cathedrals. It was whispered in councils where men chose treaties over daughters. And the women, daughters, mothers, wives, were forced to live the consequences. Their spines bent under the weight of tradition. Their lungs collapsed under endless pregnancies. Their minds shattered in prisons of grief. They did not die cursed. They died silenced. Today, in a world where science has exposed the dangers of inbreeding, it's easy to look back and say, they should have known better. But should we be so quick to judge? Even now, echoes of this mindset survive. There are still families who treat daughters as bargaining chips. Still communities where women have no voice in whom they marry. Still places where infertility or miscarriage is seen as a woman's failure, not a tragedy shared by both partners. The lesson of the Habsburg women is not locked in history. It is alive. It warns us that whenever tradition outweighs compassion, whenever ideology outweighs humanity, someone will pay the price. And more often than not, it is women. So let us name them one last time, not as cases of genetic collapse, not as mad queens or weak princesses, but as women. Maria Anna of Austria, the girl who learned too late that her body was a cage. Joanna of Castile, who loved too fiercely and was locked away for it. Margaret Teresa of Spain, married to her uncle, dead at 21. Anna of Austria, who endured humiliation for decades before giving France its son king. Marie Antoinette, broken by politics and blood, but remembered only by a lie she never spoke. The infant daughters of Spain, who lived as experiments in a dynasty's obsession, and died as children never meant to carry such weight. They were not failures of nature. They were victims of choices made by those who believed themselves above it. Stand again in one of their palaces. The chandeliers sparkle, the tourists chatter, the marble floors shine. But if you stop, if you stand still and listen, you might hear something else. A whisper, we were here. A breath, we suffered. A plea, do not let it happen again. And perhaps the faintest echo of defiance, remember us not as queens, but as women who deserved better. The story of the most inbred women in history is not just a tale of deformity, madness, or tragedy. It is a mirror. A mirror that shows us what happens when humanity is sacrificed at the altar of power. Their lives remind us of one truth that will never change. Bloodlines do not define worth. Titles do not define dignity. And no throne is worth the suffering of a single human soul. That is their legacy. That is their curse, rewritten as warning. And that is the story we must never forget.